Hello, and welcome back to class number 5 of moc103, an introduction to Mocha Pro. So there is nothing more screaming planar tracking than a classical screen insert, so this is why I picked this shot for us to tackle as a final challenge in this course. If you ask yourself, well, there are no tracking points or green screen on this mobile, well, that's what production life is. You get a shot like this handed, and you need to make it work. So this is why I chose it, because it's a real life example. What I want us to do is do a proper track on this and then insert the screenshot of a web page into this mobile phone. So let's get started. So first, I'm gonna draw up an X-spline, and just to get a feeling for the shot, I really want to track it just with the default settings and see what we come up with. That way, we already get an inkling which areas might become difficult or which approach we should take. So let's track this forwards. And you can already see that despite all these bright glares and reflections on the phone, the track holds up pretty nice. It's kind of impressive. So we get a little bit of skew in the end when the phone is pulled out of frame with this really large motion blur. So that's something to be aware of. And then let's track forwards. And at the beginning, we are basically facing the same issue. So let's just align the planar surface to get a better understanding what is happening, how much drift to expect, and so forth. So I'm going to pull that here. Don't have to be too granular with this, but it really helps to understand what is happening inside of the picture. So I'm going to align that here, here. And for good measure, I'm going to switch on the grid as well. Zoom out a little bit and just let this play. So we see already we're getting a little bit of drift once he pulls the phone back in his hand. So this is the moment where it's properly aligned. Once he pulls it back there, we're getting drift on the top right corner. And that gets even bigger once he pulls it further back. So it might be worthwhile to actually track this with perspective. So I think we could, with some adjust track and some manual control, we could make this track actually work, but we're just at the start of things. And maybe there's a way to track this a little bit better to save us some of that manual work. So let's kill that layer, switch off the grid and the planar surface, draw up a new shape. So the shape itself, I won't change too much about that because the last one worked quite nice. There were no glaring obstructions to be aware of. So something like that. If that phone had moving content, you might actually think about just tracking the edge and the notch. And what you could do for that is just use an inside shape like that. So I'm using the new shape on the same layer tool here. I could also do a subtraction shape. I think you know by now how that works. So I could pull up something like that. If we take a look at the mat view now, you see what would happen. So if this phone had moving content and you would need to track it, that would be a good way to deal about that, because then Mocha would just try to track the rim of the phone. All right, but that's not what we need to do. So let's kill this once more and drag up a new shape. Something like that. So let's take a look down here. So the minimum percentage of pixels used is by 20%. So this could explain why we're getting so much drifting issue, because 20% to stick on is not that much. Granted, we've got some big lighting changes, but I think we can make this work with a little bit more to stick on. So let's bring this up to something like 50 or 60, like that. And also let's try to actually track this with perspective. And let's go ahead. So as you might notice, once you increase the percentage, actually your render time goes a little bit up. It has to process a little bit more. And now we are getting to the area where we expected that skew. That's a little bit better, but also we are getting earlier aboard of the track because Mocha is trying to stick to 60% of the pixels in that shape. And of course, with the big motion blur going on, it can't possibly meet this demand. Of course, we'll have to reserve judgment until we see our planar surface and our grid aligned, but I think already that this is a much better track and actually will have fewer manual work to do if we take this approach. So let's track this backwards. But even in this view, you can already see that with perspective switched on and the higher percentage, this sticks much better. And I expect this to have a lot less drift. So now he pulls it down again. And once again, like before, we don't get the skewing, but we get an earlier aboard of the track. All right, so let's switch off that matte view. Let's also bring this to a sharp, clear frame where we can easily align our planar surface like that. Gonna zoom in here a little bit. Bring this over here. This down here. So let's switch on that grid and let's verify our track. So this works much, much better already. Yeah, I think this is what we should go with, definitely. This is much better. All right, so the track itself is quite easy, and I think in the previous classes you learned how to deal with occlusions and the like. However, how do we deal with the beginning and the end where we really got no viable tracking data? Well, the idea is to use the manual track option down here. And the way you do that is you go to the very last frame where that shape is properly aligned. That's not necessarily the last frame of your track. So let's say, so we're good here. And from here, we really have to make a good judgment about the motion blur, because the motion blur is really obscuring the clear line here, obviously. But if we aim for the middle, I think we're still good here. Still kind of good here. And if it doesn't work, we can still use the adjust track option that I showed you in the very first class. So this is the last frame with a good solid track. And from there, you want to switch on manual track. What this changes is two things. Normally, you aren't able to animate your planar surface. This is now changed, and this is indicated by the pink and blue dotted line. So now you're in animate mode. And normally, the track would drive your shape and your surface. And now this is switched around. Now your surface drives the shape and the track. What that means is that by now you have to hand animate your track by using the four corners of the shape. Before you do anything, really, just make sure to lay down a keyframe, and then you can go forward and adjust these to your needs. So now you see how the shape changes and the grid in regards to me adjusting the surface. And this will help us bring this to the proper end, because now we are getting this little bit of a skew problem here. We can adjust that. Bring that down here. So this is now the area where we actually haven't got any track at all. It's no problem. Let's bring this down. And it's areas like these where it's really handy to have the grid on as well, because that gives me a far better judgment whether these distances are supposedly rightish, because I haven't really got another guide. So you can see right here, it's far bigger. The distance seems a little bit bigger, and I would say that my squares are a little bit squeezed, so I should probably bring this down a little bit more to something like this, to not squeeze my insert of the website at the very end. And there, we're out of the woods. All right, so let's get to the very beginning and repeat the process there. So this was for fixing our beginning and our end. Still, I want to give this a really close look whether our corners are sitting in the right place the whole time. So let's go in there and take a look. So we're getting a little bit of drift here. And this is the kind of issue that I really like to fix in the adjust track module. So I'm going to look for sharp screen to use as my reference screen. So now that I've got a frame where I can really align this well, I have to make sure to switch back to large motion, because remember, I'm still on manual track. And even though this is an area that I tracked with large motion, if I would now use manual track, I would adjust my track and could really mess up the very, very good track I have here in the middle. So make sure to switch this back to large motion. Now I'm not animating my surface anymore, but just aligning it like that, like that. Check the bottom, it looks good. Looks good as well. So this is an ideal reference frame. So let's head over to the adjust track module and let's select all 4 of those and set up points for those. So I've got 4 points now, and those are my reference points. With those, now we can scroll through this and give this another layer of adjustment. And this is why it makes sense to fix issues on the track itself with the manual track and have manual refinement. And the adjust track module just gives you another layer of control. And if you have to revisit your project, you know where to look for these things. So we've got a little bit of drift here. So this one is still good. Gonna set a keyframe down on that and bring this over here a little bit. This one could use a little bit as well. And a little bit more compensation here. And don't overdo it with the keyframes on the adjust track, because that's a perfect way to introduce more problems than you originally had. So use this cautiously. Also make sure not to mistake the edges of your planar surface with your adjust points, because that way, as I said before, in this mode, the planar surface is not animatable. You'll just offset it And for the kind of corrective animation you want to do, you really need to grab the red adjust points here. All right, so that's that. Now let's take a look how to import our custom insert into Mocha. Let me preface this that I would only do this for purposes like validating my track or doing a slap comp. I would not actually, under normal circumstances, do my compositing inside of Mocha. There might be exceptions or scenarios where you might want to export an image sequence of your tracked image out of Mocha for further refinement down the road in another application. And we'll discuss all that. But while Mocha is a great tracker, it's not really that much of a compositing tool. So don't expect too much when you import your insert into here. So to do that, you need Mocha Pro. This will not be available in Mocha AE because the insert module is Mocha Pro only. So go over here and we can switch off our grid for now. So down here, we've got the insert clip drop-down menu, and this is the one we used in the very first class to insert our Mocha logo. And if we pop that open, you'll find the option to import a clip. So now we get the very same pop-up menu we get when setting up a new project. And we can hit choose, navigate to the place where our graphic is, like here, and insert our favorite website, like that. Now, if you're wondering why this comes along so nicely and even the notches say it out, I prepped a proper alpha channel for this picture. So if you want to take a look at that, you can pull up the drop-down menu, and now the website will appear here. So you see that here. And if we switch off the RGB, we can see the alpha for that. You'll also see a crop box. I'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's head back to our pre-comp here. So let's turn off the GUI and see if everything works out so far. There's a lot of reflection on the border. So this is one of the reasons why I said this is not really the application where you want to do a proper composite, but you can get a good idea if your tracks work when you import your insert into Mocha. So let me name this insert website. Before we render this though, let's take a look at the options we have here. So we can set an opacity and a very basic color correction for our insert. We can, which is not really applicable to our use case, but in other scenarios this might be helpful, set up a warp. So you can set up a warp mesh that you can actually use to warp this picture, like so. Let me undo that, we don't need that. You can also give your image somewhat of a feather, and you can set a transform after the fact. So if you, for one reason or another, for example, want to scale this up a tad, you can do so. So let me bring this to 1.1. So then you'll scale up the image, including the alpha channel. So those are pretty much locked together. Let me bring this back to the default. And I told you about the crop box. I'll show you that as well. So if you head over to source, you can actually set a crop box for that. And you can make that region of interest that you set up here fit the surface, or fit the surface to the region of interest. But I'm going to reset all that. So now we're back to the original insert. And as before, instead of the tracking buttons, now we get the render buttons down here, and we can render that clip in both directions. So we take a look, of course, the whole thing falls apart here where the picture gets massively motion blurred. However, we can switch that on. So just hit that checkbox and Mocha will apply proper motion blur. If you want a preview of that, just use the cogwheel here in the middle to render just one single frame and you can see how that frame works out for you. So let's render this with a motion blur and I'll be with you in a minute. So let's frame this up and take a proper look. I'll also switch off the GUI. And if we take a look, this gives us a much better feeling whether our track sits in place or not. And I think we're really doing fine here in the beginning. I think I'll do some minor adjustments at the end because the picture drifts off quite a lot here. I think I'm going to use the adjust track on that. And just bring this over here. And something to get used to, you're now seeing the rendered image. So it'll not update immediately. So you either have to go back to the insert module, re-render that to properly judge it, or go back to the adjust track. And up here in the drop-down menu, change from insert composite to selected layer. And that way you get a proper view and can adjust your track in real time. But of course, then you'll lose the preview of the motion blur because it's so render heavy. So I'm gonna go back to my insert, go to the last frame before I made any adjustments, go over to the insert module, and just render this to the end for the last couple of frames. So there's just one more frame I want to adjust down here. Yeah, that's better. So as you can see, the possibilities to actually change your insert are pretty basic. And one example is the motion blur, because if you thought you could adjust this by changing the properties down here in the edge width like we did with the rotoscoping class, that is not possible. This is a motion blur derived from the movement of the shape, and you can choose to either switch it on or off, but you've got no further control of it. However, if you still want to render out this clip with a mat, this is the workflow to go. So if you've got your shape selected, and up here from the file menu, you select export rendered clip, then we'll check that we have got the insert selected. We'll have that with an alpha. You can also export a composite, but then you won't have an alpha, or you can choose just to export a mat, which will not be the alpha, but instead the track shape you did. So we want to go with this one, and we want to include the alpha. I'm going to specify a render folder for that. I'll go with the TIFF file format because that supports an alpha. We'll go with an index width of 4, and let's just render that. So as we pre-rendered that clip to view it, this now goes really, really fast, much faster than when we exported our rendered shapes in the rotoscoping class. So I loaded our rendered sequence into Nuke. So if you want to take a look, this is the result. I'll zoom in a little bit. So the render looks quite fine. We got the proper motion blur applied once we get to an area where it's visible, like here. And as you might notice, this is an unpre-multiplied image. This is the accompanying alpha, so you got the motion blur on there as well. So depending on how your host application manages pre-multiplication, you might have to pre-multiply that image like I did here. So that way the alpha and the RGB channels get pre-multiplied, and then I can merge that over our source footage like that. So there you got your comp. You can definitely work that way because now you have got the ability to treat the insert independent of the background. However, you've got all the motion already applied to here. So this is why I personally favor the workflow of exporting the tracking data and applying it inside the host application. Something we'll look into in a minute. This is the workflow if you're using the standalone version of Mocha Pro. If you're using the plugin versions, it's slightly different. So as you can see here, I got a Mocha Pro node already connected to the source footage, and the Mocha Pro node has got a second input, which is the insert. So this is where I inserted exactly the same insert like we did before, like that. So let me frame that up. It's got the same alpha channel, it's the same footage. So if we enter that, and I'll just very quickly show you the differences. So instead of the name of the layer, you actually get that insert layer. So if you choose inside the insert module to insert something, you'll have insert layer instead of website. So once you're back in your host application, you have to specify what Mocha should render out of its plugin. So to do that, you have to do two things. Mocha Pro, as you know by now, has got various modules, so you have to select the correct one. So we want to render either the composite of the insert or the cutout of the insert. That's your choice. And then you have to activate the render. And then Mocha will put that out with an appropriate alpha channel, so you can do your comp from there. I would suggest against that because the Mocha Pro plugin, as you know by now, especially when dealing with motion blur, is really heavy on the rendering, and it can make your comp really, really slow. If you want to use it that way, I would suggest you do a pre-render here and do your comp from there onwards. But honestly, I really strongly would suggest that you export your metadata and apply your tracking inside your host application. And that is something that we'll explore for After Effects, Nuke and Flame, like we did with the Roto class now. So for the metadata export, I'll do exactly the same thing as I did with the rotoscoping class. So I'll timestamp this and we'll treat After Effects, Nuke and Flame each on its own. So you can skip ahead to the part that is of interest to you, and then I hope to see you for the conclusion. All right, so for After Effects, like with our rotoscoping, I would strongly suggest that you use the plugin for After Effects. It's just because of the tight integration between Mocha AE and After Effects. This is so much easier than manually exporting your data. So to do that, let's bring up our source footage and make a comp out of that. And there, let's just apply Mocha Pro as an effect. And I'll quickly launch the Mocha UI to merge in our project data from this standalone project. Like that. Choose that Mocha file. And from there, we'll just save and exit. All right, so now we got that there. Going back to our project settings, we see I already got that website insert in here. So normally you would suspect me to just drag this in here, drop it down there, and then apply the tracking data. And we'll do that, but there's a caveat. Just want to quickly mention that. So if we go in here, what you need to do is go to the layer where your Mocha Pro plugin is. There it sits. I'm gonna call up the effect controls here. And under the tracking data portion, you can choose to create track data. So now the plugin will look inside Mocha and see what layers there are. In our example, there's just one layer, so we choose that. And now you see, if we expand this, that Mocha now loaded in all this tracking data into After Effects. And from there, you can link that to various other effects. You can use expressions, whatever you like. However, what we want to do is a classical corner pin. So what you need to do for that, you've got the export option down here. So right now we just loaded the data into the plugin. Now we need to export it to our layer. So in the export option, we can choose corner pin or a corner pin that supports motion blur. We can also use a transform, but that would only give us translation, rotation, and scale. So we'll choose the corner pin with motion blur, and then we'll specify a layer to apply that to, which should be our website TIFF. So like that. And now I'll just hit apply. And now you see the problem. Because our insert has got a different resolution, it'll be offsetted. So what we need to do is slightly different. We need to get back to our project, and instead of applying the website.tiff straight away, we need to make a pre-comp. So we'll choose new comp from selection, and we'll change this composition settings. So we'll change it to UHD. That's 3840 times 2160. And we'll make sure our pre-composition is long enough. So our clip is 120 frames. That means we need to go 6 seconds exactly. All right. So now going back to our initial composition, instead of dragging the website.tiff, I'll drag the pre-comp in here. And now we have to change one more thing. Head inside your pre-composition and right-click that website layer, and under transform, choose fit to comp. So you'll get this really stretched image, but now our insert dimensions directly match the one of the background. And that way, when we get back, we can choose the effects controls of the Mocha Pro plugin. We'll select that new layer, select that website pre-comp, and apply that export. And now it fits in there perfectly. One more thing to do, of course, before we watch this is switching on motion blur on that website pre-comp. And now we can render that. So now you can see that the rendering inside of the After Effects engine is much quicker than the rendering we did on the Mocha engine. And now you've got the freedom to do any changes you want to do to the insert inside the pre-comp, and you can also apply a lot of effects in your main comp. So I think this gives you much more flexibility than rendering inside of Mocha. So whether you're working with the standalone version or the OFX plugin for Nuke, the workflow is identical from start to finish. So what you want to do is select your layer on the left-hand side, and down here on the export data option, you'll choose export track. And that will bring us up to this dialog, and we'll see 3 options we've got for Nuke. So the Nuke ASCII is pretty much legacy, and you don't need that. What we'll use is the corner pin, and as a supplemental, we'll also use the tracker. So let's start with the corner pin, and let's just copy that to our clipboard and switch over to Nuke. And there you can apply that to your insert like that, and merge it on top of your footage like that. And of course, like we had to with the OFX plugin version, we have to take care of the pre-multiplication. So let's insert a pre-mult here. That's all fine. So now we should have exactly the same thing as in Mocha, except the motion blur, because as we just translated the metadata, Nuke is not aware that it should apply motion blur. So let's set that up. I'm going to go to the end here where we've got really fast motion blur going on. And inside the corner pin, you can switch that on. So I'll choose a quality of 2. And once it renders this, you might think that your layer is offset or this doesn't look right because you get so much of the underlying original footage blending through. Well, the problem is that while Mocha is rendering a centered motion blur, by default, the Nuke motion blur is pivoted to one side, to the beginning of the frame. So what you have to do is you have to adjust your shutter offset. So change this to centered and maybe increase the shutter a little bit more. So let's bring this up. And while there's still some compositing work to be done, this fits in here much better. So if we do before and after, that looks pretty good. All right. So what you can additionally export yourself some helper data. So head back to Mocha and just export yourself a Nuke tracker node, copy that to the clipboard, bring it in, and just hook it up to your source footage. And that way you can get access to all those trackers if you want to use them for your comp. The workflow of exporting metadata from Mocha to Flame is exactly the same whether using the standalone version of Mocha or the plugin version. So you're going to select your layer, and then under the export data menu down here, you're going to select export track. And then we're going to scroll up to the Autodesk Inferno Flame Fire and so forth. And there we've got a couple of options. And let me just say the ones that don't include Flame 2014 onwards are legacy. So both the point tracker data and the stabilizer data are legacy if they don't include the Flame 2014 suffix in parentheses. Why is that? Well, in Flame 2014, the tracker order was changed. So if you accidentally choose the legacy ones, you'll end up with a picture that is twisted halfway in the middle. Then let's quickly talk about the difference between the point tracker data and the stabilizer data. If you choose the point tracker data, you'll export ASCII files that you can individually import into each tracker, while with the stabilizer, you'll export one node. I personally prefer to use the point tracker data because then I can multi-purpose that, whether I'm applying it to a corner pin inside of Action or a tracker in any other node. So I'll choose that. And as you can see, copy to clipboard is grayed out. That doesn't work, so you'll have to save it out and specify a location for Mocha to save it. So let's choose that. And I'll quickly navigate to my metadata folder. There, class05. And I'll name this insert website and save it away there and head over to Flame. So inside of Flame, you want to use an action node to apply that. I'm going to pull that out here, kiss that in there, and get myself a media layer and hook up my insert and the accompanying alpha. And here, you'll just have to select that surface and change that from a flat to a bilinear, like so. And now you can import the tracking data to your vertices. So select that and enter the tracker. And there on tracker 1, hit import, navigate to the location where you saved those files. So inside here, the normal workflow is if you've got tracker 1 selected, hit import, and in the location where you exported your trackers from Mocha, you'll find trackers aptly named. So load tracker 1 to tracker 1, tracker 2 to tracker 2, tracker 3 to tracker 3, and tracker 4 to tracker 4. Boom. So now this should work 95% of the times. It does, except in our case. So if we shuttle through this, you can see our picture is turned by 90 degrees. Why is that? Well, as you can see, at the beginning of the clip, the mobile is held at a very deep, steep angle and then turns in almost 90 degrees. So basically, Mocha and Flame are in disagreement on what is the top left corner. While Flame thinks this is the top left corner, Mocha thinks this is the top left corner. So we'll have to manually rearrange these. So let's once again hit into the tracker and take a look. So tracker 1 is up here, but we actually need it down here. Tracker 2 is up here, we need it over there. Tracker 4 needs to be up here, and tracker 3 needs to be over here. So the way to do that is to specify it the following way. So for tracker 2, we have to load up the tracking data of tracker 1. So now that sits over there. For tracker 4, we have to load in the tracking data of tracker number 2. Now it sits up there. For tracker 3, we have to load in the tracker data of tracker 4. And for tracker 1, we have to load in the tracking data of tracker number 3. I know this is not exactly what you expect. It is a really, really rare case, but it shows the advantage of saving out this point tracker data. And actually, this was not planned. This happened purely by chance. As I said, 95% of the time, the normal lineup of tracker 1 to tracker 1, tracker 2 to tracker 2, and so forth works just fine. If we return now, you see there is our image. And now we can take a look for a frame where we can align our motion blur, maybe around here. So head on over to the node preferences and set up your action motion blur. Maybe to something like that. And there you go. So this concludes this introductory course to Mocha Pro, and I hope I was able to convey to you the basics and principles of planar tracking and all the benefits you can reap when you apply it properly. There's so much more to Mocha, but with these fundamentals you should be set for the bulk of your tracking and rotor work. Once again, thanks for joining me in this course. I hope to see you again soon here on FX PhD. If you've got any questions, just hit me up on the FX PhD Slack channel. Until then, bye-bye.